think it's about time to start. So handouts, I was running late. Handouts were on the table, but I got them out late. So if you don't have a handout that says David and Goliath at the top. So David and Goliath is this morning. If you don't have a David and Goliath handout and you want one, let me know. Parker's got the stack, and he's going to pass them out real quick. So if you'll just raise your hand high enough for Parker to see, he'll get your handout to you. Just while he's doing that, on Wednesday, we're going to look at Moses and the Exodus. Now, Moses and the Exodus covers a lot of ground in the Bible. So I went ahead and put out Wednesday's handout is out here on the table in the foyer. So let me have one, Parker. Here you go. There you go. Moses and the Exodus, the handout is out there if you can. It's a story we all know, but if you can just kind of look, hasn't been a lot of homework in this class, but before Wednesday, just look at the story of Moses and the Exodus. Like I said, it's a lot of stuff, but the handout will help you kind of cover the ground that we're going to be looking at on Wednesday, kind of give you an idea of how that class will go. 15? Okay. I was just going to stop early. Just stare. Yeah. All right. Okay. One more, yeah. All right. So that just about, I think that's everybody. Okay. So on Wednesday, we talked about the ideas of justification and sanctification. Justification being the idea that you stand justified. The judge looks at you and pronounces your innocence. He looks at all of the evidence. It's not that he sets the law aside. It's not that he says you're guilty, but I pardon or I commute your sentence. The judge looks at all the evidence and he says you're not guilty. I look at you and I see innocence. And so that's what we looked at on Wednesday. And looked how sometimes the idea of justification can get kind of conflated with the idea of sanctification, the idea of being set apart. Now, after class, one of the things that came up in a conversation, the parking lot conversation, was the idea that there is some sort of sanctification that occurs like at the moment of salvation. Like we are separated from the world. And the Bible even alludes to the fact they refer to the moment of salvation as being sanctified. And that is true. And the Bible also then speaks about sanctification being a process. Like as we grow in maturity and we grow in our holiness. The Bible talks about, look, you're still on milk, but you should be on meat. Well, that's a process. It's a process of growth, and we see that in the Bible and how we might be able to use that in our evangelizing efforts. When we go out into the world and people, look at them and say, God can pronounce you innocent. And they say, well, but I'm not innocent. Well, He can pronounce you innocent, and then that process of becoming more pure and more holy is a process that God expects to take place over time. So that's what we looked at on Wednesday. To kind of wrap that up, as we finished up the class on Wednesday, I said I wanted to kind of come back to this real quickly and ask, where do we see this theme of sanctification specifically? We talk a lot about justification in our corporate worship service, but maybe not so much always the idea of sanctification. And so I wanted to talk about that. I've got one example that's going to, the reason I want to come back to it, my example is going to lead into this morning's class. But let's just kind of open it up, be thinking about that. Before we start class, Jerry said he would lead us in a word of prayer. Right. Oh, okay. Not that one. All right. So, between Wednesday and now, Did anybody have an example of where we see this idea of sanctification come up in our worship service, in our prayers or sermons or songs we sing and things like that? Yeah. Take time to, okay, how so? So the answer for, not everybody can hear, the idea is take time to be holy. Yeah. So, yeah. The feed on His Word. And the idea of like going from milk to meat, feeding on His Word, make friends with God's children. Somebody that was in the world and then becomes a Christian. They are set apart in a way, but you can't underestimate that power of being surrounded by other Christians and the ability of other people to help transform your lives. No.
So anytime we refer to the saints, if we say we're saints in Christ Jesus or the saints in Cedar Park, we don't use that term perhaps as much as Scripture uses it. But when we do that, that's the exact same word. What it's talking about is a saint is someone who has been sanctified.
Yeah.
Set apart.
Yeah. Real good example. The song that we sing, Jesus Draw Me Ever Near. So Dean led this on Sunday. It's not in the songbook, so you can't follow along. I'm going to read it to you, and I promise I will try not to sing it. Nobody needs that this morning. But the song, Jesus Draw Me Ever Nearer, as I labor through the storm, you have called me to this passage, and I'll follow though I'm worn. May this journey bring a blessing. May I rise on wings of faith. And at the end of my heart's testing, with your likeness let me wake. Jesus, guide me through the tempest, keep my spirit stayed and sure. When the midnight meets the morning, let me love you even more. Let the treasures of the trial form within me as I go. At the end of this long passage, let me leave them at your throne. The theme as we go through the song is Jesus drawing us nearer, but it's the idea of a journey. And he even says it there in the last stanza, let the treasures of the trial form within me as I go. At the end of this long passage, may this journey bring a blessing. Guide me through the tempest as I go, as I labor through the storm. We're on this journey, we're traveling. By way of introduction to this morning's class, we talk about David and Goliath. What we're going to do in the next couple of lessons is have a comparison of the Bible's idea of redemption and sanctification and the world's idea of redemption and sanctification. Typically, if you read books, if you go watch movies, if you read like The Hobbit, right? So like the Lord of the Rings type adventure books, Indiana Jones and things like that. How do journeys typically bring about blessings? Like when does the blessing occur in the course of the journey? Typically in pop culture.
When the prize is acquired or the task is completed.
All right, so.
Since you had two different types of books there.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a struggle, then it's overcome. When the task is completed, Rick said, like at the end. It's at the end. Indiana Jones, he's got the bag of sand and he's got the gold thing, right? And he's got to make the switch really quick and then run away. Like after he does the thing at the end of the journey, and you're going to see this theme, we're going to talk about it again later on in class. But the idea of like the knight or the prince, he goes out, he takes his trusty steed, and he rides away to battle the great dragon. So he goes to the cave, and he fights the dragon, and after he conquers the dragon, he gets what? The maiden or the gold, like the dragon's got a cave. The dragon wants a cave full of gold, I don't know. But the dragon has a cave full of gold, and he's got the maiden, and the knight goes out, and after he conquers the dragon, he obtains the prize. When man writes stories, that's how we write them. But that's not the idea of sanctification. And that's not the idea that we see in Jesus Draw Me Nearer. says, let the treasures of the trial form within me as I go. There's nothing wrong with the idea of, I've got a mansion over the hilltop. Okay, so that's another song that we sing. And like, at the end of my life, I will receive a crown. Like, I am living this way in hopes of obtaining heaven. Listen, if God didn't want us to look forward to heaven, He wouldn't have told us it was so great. He wouldn't have described it as streets of gold with pearly gates. He described it that way so that we would want to obtain that prize. But this song, I think, highlights the idea of sanctification, because let the treasures of the trial form within me as I go. As I go through the trial, I want the treasure to form within me, and at the end of this long passage, let me leave them at your throne. I am forming a treasure within me as I go through the trial, and whenever the trial's over, at the end, instead of obtaining a prize, I take this treasure that I've formed, this new me that has happened, this transition that has changed and occurred in my life, and I'm going to take that and then I'm going to present it to you after the trial is over. It's a different way of looking at, and I think this song in particular looks at that different way of looking at justification and sanctification, but in particular the idea of sanctification and the treasures forming within us as we go, and not something that we obtain as a prize at the end. Go ahead, Travis.
In Jesus' prayer in John 17, where he prayed for his disciples, and I think he prays for us today, one of the things he mentioned there was sanctify them in the truth, your word is true.
Yeah.
And that idea of how we become sanctified is through the better understanding of his truth.
Yeah. So the idea of sanctify them by your truth, and sanctification comes from the truth. The more you know God, like the more you come to know Him, the more you're going to love Him, and the more that love for God is going to change your life. Right. If there's no more comments on that, we'll get into this morning's class. We might have time to come back to that. If you'll turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel 17. We're going to look at the story of David and Goliath this morning. For the sake of time, we're not going to read all of 1 Samuel 17. We're going to start reading in verse 2, then we're going to kind of just jump down. It's a story that most of us should be familiar with. But we're going to start reading in 1 Samuel 17, starting in verse 2. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in a line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had a bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And a shield bearer who went before him, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. In verse 16 it tells us, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. Twice a day for 40 days he came out and challenged them." In verse 24 it said, "All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid." In verse 26, "And David said to the men who stood by him," so the story progresses. David's at home keeping the sheep for his father. His father says, "Here, bring this food to your brothers who are there at the battle." He brings it to them. David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel?" In verse 38, "Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. He tried to go in vain, for he had not tested them. So David cast off the armor. He says, look, this isn't going to work. This is not my stuff. Don't worry, I don't need any of this anyway. And he takes it all off, and he takes his sling, and he goes and he collects 5 smooth stones, it says, from the brook. In verse 41, and the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, and am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies to the host of the Philistines this day, to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword and the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, in verse 50, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. When we read the story of David and Goliath, I think there's some great lessons that we can pull out of it. Like spiritual lessons, but also like very practical lessons that we can draw out of it for our lives. And so, question for the class. What are some of the characteristics of David that we would want to emulate in our lives?
First and foremost is trust in the Lord.
So trust in the Lord. Goliath came out and he identified the army as belonging to who? Saul. Yeah, he said Saul's men. David came out and identified the army as belonging to God. So David, from the very beginning, his entire outlook on the entire situation was different than Goliath and the Philistines, but also completely different, evidently, than all of the other Israelites too. Right?
David was indignant that anyone would speak ill of God's people.
Yeah. The answer was, it seems that he was indignant over the idea that Goliath would talk like this about God's people. Not only that, he seems really frustrated that nobody else is doing anything about it. This has been going on for over a month, twice a day. And David's like, you can see him just like, I imagine him just really exasperated, like, well, what's going on? Like, and there's a prize? Like, I also get to marry Saul's daughter if I do this? Well, yeah, then what is y'all's problem, right?
I think, despite the fact I would like to be a good sling thrower, I think David, we talked about his trust in God's faith, but he was willing. I think there's been times where I certainly would espouse how I'm faithful, but was I willing? Was I willing to put myself in prayer? Go out there? So it's a pretty big step.
Yeah. You would think that surely somebody in this army was probably thinking, God could win this, right? Like they've seen the evidence, like they know that God is powerful. Surely somebody is sitting there thinking, God could win this battle. I hope somebody steps up, right? So it's not just knowing that God can win, but being willing to be God's tool too. Yes, ma'am.
When David went to meet Goliath, his armor was invisible, if you will.
Yeah.
Because the armor we see in the New Testament, he girded himself and he covered himself in the way he was supposed to, with God on his side. Whereas the Philistine, a weapon in and of himself without any armor,
Yeah.
he could have slayed them all, I'm sure, with just his bare hands.
Yeah.
But he went in fully armored, plus an armor shield bearer with it. I mean, he had everything at his disposal. And I think a lot of the time we think we have to have so many outwardly things to make ourselves, fight the good fight, when it's really simple. It's God's word.
Yeah.
And it's not our beautiful speech, and it's not our talent and ability. It's truly what touches people is God's word.
Yeah.
And we have to
You know, at the very end, in verse 50, there was no sword in the hand of David. It's like, hey, I just want to make sure everybody understands. He didn't bring a sword to this fight. Right? Like, that's how the story kind of wraps up. Yes, sir.
I don't remember the author, but somewhere in the past days, the application of this, slaying the giants in your life.
Mm-hmm.
During your life, you will come across challenges that are bigger than you, but with God at your side, you're trusting Him, you can overcome them like David did Goliath.
So we're going to, matter of fact, we're going to pause right there. We're going to come back to that in just a second. So all these characteristics of David that we would want to emulate, when we read the story of David and Goliath, who do we most want to associate ourselves with? And I think, yeah, okay, so that answered it right there, right? Like, we want to be David. And I think that maybe this is, we've talked about some of the baggage that we bring into these conversations as Americans. I think this might be part of it. Like, hey, we've got a couple of scrappy folks over on the East Coast who threw some tea over the side of a ship and then overthrew England, right? Like, we have this story of the underdog built into us. Evidence of the fact that Americans love the story of the underdog can be seen in every sports movie ever. In Rudy, The Replacements, Invincible, Remember the Titans, The Bad News Bears, if you switch to baseball, A League of Their Own, Moneyball, The Rookie, Miracle for hockey, The Mighty Ducks for hockey, Cool Runnings, it's not hockey, but it's ice related. Boxing, The $1 Million Baby, Rocky 1 through 5, and then Rocky Balboa, most recently, Cinderella Man, Real Steel. At the bottom it says, it's Rocky with robots. It's a much better movie than that subtitle gives it. It's actually really good. But it's a story of the scrappy underdog robot who beats the other bigger, stronger robots with the help of the scrappy underdog, like video game guy who's playing the robot. The Underdogs, right? Like the football movie, The Underdogs. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon, and it's a fact that people are more interested in stories about underdogs. In 2007, a study found that when a group of people were presented with two imaginary Olympic swimmers, I'm assuming this was sometime around the Summer Olympics, people were presented, hey, here's two Olympic swimmers. And they were completely fictitious, but we talk about the statistics and where they're from and their practice regimen and all these things. I'm describing these two Olympic swimmers to you. Every single person in the study believed, didn't just hope for, but believed that the underdog would win. For no reason at all. Contrary to all the evidence, people were like, the underdog, like, we're not just hopeful, we believe it, that it will happen. We are emotionally invested in the underdog. And it's not just us, it's a worldwide thing, but particularly with us, it's something that we see. David, on the surface and in the eyes of the Israelites, he was an underdog. And since David is an underdog who wins, we want to associate ourselves with him. I think that's the natural reaction that we have. We had a hand up over here. Do you have something, Rick?
We've got to be careful with tossing the term around underdog as far as what we're talking about here, because David was not an underdog.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to pause you right there.
Yeah.
Give me just a minute.
We've got to remember there's a difference between human reasoning and spiritual reasoning.
Okay, so give me just 1 minute. I got about 20 minutes of class left. We're going to get there in just a second. So the internet, like we talked about, is full of blogs and articles, and YouTube is full of sermons associating ourselves with David in his fight against Goliath. I think you said defeating the giants in our lives and things like that, facing the giants in our lives, 3 steps to defeating the giants in your life, how to slay your giants. I went to YouTube, I said David and Goliath sermon, and these are the titles. The internet's full of them. And I'm not saying that they're all bad. I'm not saying that we can't learn anything from David and his fight with Goliath and practical. All the lessons that we came up with are true. I'll give you my personal one. I saved it for now so that you'll know that I believe it too. So side note, this is Eric's takeaway from the story of David and Goliath. As the father of 3 sons, we have a lot of fathers of sons and grandfathers of sons out here. In the story of David and Goliath, David believed that God would defeat Goliath, that God had the power to defeat Goliath. But he knew that David was able to defeat Goliath, but what was it that gave him the willpower to actually stand up and be the one? Do you remember what he told his brothers and what he told Saul? What did he talk about whenever, what's the evidence? I believe that God can do it, and I believe that I can be the tool. I have evidence of the fact that I can be God's tool. What was that? The lion and the bear. He said, I was watching my father's sheep, and a bear came up, and I killed the bear. It's the bear, I think it's the bear. He says, and I grabbed her by her face. He grabbed the bear by the face, and he killed the bear. So as a parent, something we can take away from this is life is dangerous. And we have to let our kids do dangerous things sometimes. Because what if David had come home and said, hey, Mom, today I was out with the sheep and I saw a lion, off in the distance. And he was looking at the sheep kind of funny. And his mom said, that's it. No more watching sheep for you. There's lions out there. Or David came home and said, listen, today I killed a bear. He was trying to get the sheep. Don't worry, everything's fine. And she said, no. And David's dad said, no more watching sheep for you, little David. It's too dangerous. After he killed the lion, they let him go back and fight a bear. And that came in useful later in life because then David, his evidence within himself that I am able to be God's tool was the fact I've already killed a lion and a bear, and this guy's defying God. I know I can beat him. So I'm invested in this idea that there are lessons we can take away from David. And those are good lessons that we need to take away from the story. But there's another look at the story of David and Goliath that we should consider. So I'm not saying that any of that is wrong. I'm just saying there's another look at it, the other side of the coin. I think this is the other side of the coin that Rick was alluding to. The other look at the story of David and Goliath that we should consider. And this perspective allows us to see in it the theme of God's plan of redemption for man. The Israelites were a people who were trying to follow God. They weren't always very good at it, and we're pretty hard on them for that. But they're not necessarily, I think, any better or worse than many of us today. They were a broken and sinful people. So the 3 characters in the story is a broken and sinful people. Then there was an overwhelming enemy, an enemy that couldn't be conquered, an enemy that no amount of strategy or cunning or strength could defeat. The Israelites were powerless before the enemy. So you've got broken and sinful people, and you have a powerful enemy. And then there was David. David was a man after God's own heart. David was chosen by God to lead his people and to save them from an enemy they couldn't fight on their own. In the story of David and Goliath, we have broken and sinful people, we have an overwhelming enemy, and we have a man after God's own heart. Of those 3 characters, which one most closely resembles us today? Not who we want to be like in the story, but which one of them most closely resembles us? It's the broken and sinful people. In the story of David and Goliath, we can learn a lot about how to live our lives from the example of David. But in that story, we're not David. In the story of David and Goliath, we're the Israelites. The other side of the coin is that we're the sinful and scared people facing an enemy that we could never defeat. Sin has brought wrath on us that we can't appease. The idea of propitiation. A debt that we can't repay, the idea of redemption. A broken relationship that we can't heal, reconciliation. And incurred a guilty sentence that we can't avoid, the idea of justification. All of that is the enemy that's standing in front of us. And when I read through that list, it seems like an enemy that there's no way I can defeat him. It looks like a 9.5-foot giant to me. Those things are the Goliaths in the story. So really, deep down inside, as much as we want to be David, who do we most resemble in the story? I think it's the Israelites. When Satan marches out every day in front of you and dares you to resist him, do we? Like, we know that we have the tools at hand, but the question is, do we? Because it didn't take David any time at all to respond and to fight Goliath. The Israelites were at least 40 days into it before they had someone fight for them. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think this comes with maturity as a Christian. Each time you fight one of those battles, and it may be a small battle at the beginning, something you're trying to overcome in your life, and it may seem small or insignificant to other people, but there's a problem in your life. But with God's help, you overcome that. It gives you strength, like David got stronger by killing the lion and the bear. He worked his way up to Goliath.
Yeah.
We are working our way up, hopefully each and every day, towards conquering the big things in our life.
The idea of becoming more holy, right? Of being sanctified, of every day being set apart a little bit more. I think that we've got a minute. Okay, so side note, like just kind of sidebar, this idea that we're talking about for a second. I don't believe that trophies for everybody is necessarily useful. Okay? I don't think that that's necessarily useful. I think that the pendulum swinging the other way and the knee-jerk reaction that we have to trophies for everybody is also not useful. The idea that, no, trophies aren't for everybody. Only the winners get trophies, right? Like only the winners. Because back whenever I played, insert sport from whenever, whatever time period, not only the winners got trophies. And I think that in that knee-jerk reaction, sometimes what we fail to do is recognize try. We fail to recognize that people are trying and to recognize effort and good, wholesome effort. Does everybody need a trophy that says they're the winner? No. Words have meanings. You didn't win. You don't get a trophy for winning if you didn't win. But can we do something to recognize effort? You tried really hard, and I'm proud of you for trying so hard. Because even if you didn't win, you did something. And you know what? Something's better than nothing. Right? So, sidebar, sorry. And I think it ties in spiritually, the knee-jerk reaction that we have, that you can either win or you can lose, leaves out sanctification completely. It leaves out the idea that a lot of people come to Christ from a lot of different places, and that not all of us are going to look exactly the same all the time. Yeah, Noah.
So what you just said was very similar to what I was about to express, and that is you used the word effort. Another related word would be progress.
Yeah.
Right? And if you just look at two people externally, if you look at whether it's in a secular thing or in their spiritual walk, you may look at one and think, well, they're further progressed than the other. When really, they could have started from very different places, and that person could be stagnant and lukewarm, and this person actually be putting in effort and making progress, but they may have started 10 steps behind.
Yeah.
And they're actually being sanctified.
Yeah.
They're going through the process of sanctification, and this person over here just looks like they are, and they're actually stagnant. And you never can know just from the externals.
Yeah. When Satan comes down off his side of the valley and he looks like sexual temptation, do we always sling rocks at him? When he looks like frustration and anger and ugliness towards our brothers or our sisters or our parents, do we always suppress that or do we give in to it? When he looks like jealousy of your peers who are prettier or stronger or faster or richer or smarter, do we always fight against him? And the answer to that should reveal to us which one of the people we are in the story. Because David did, and he didn't hesitate. The Israelites hid from Goliath because they were scared of him. David in the story would be Christ in our story of redemption, the unexpected hero. He conquered Goliath alone while his brothers and the other Israelites mocked him. He conquered death without our help while we were still in rebellion against him. We're going to go back again to Romans 5. We've read this, I think, 4 classes in a row now. Romans 5, starting in verse 6. For while we were weak at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for the righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows His love for us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by His blood, much more shall we be saved by Him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by His life. More than that, we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. David didn't go out and fight Goliath because everybody believed in him. Nobody believed in him. God showed His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were in open rebellion against Him, He died for us. So we've got a few minutes left. In terms of the discussion about looking at the story of David and Goliath, we can look at it from a practical point of view, and that's a good thing to do. We can also look at it the other side of the coin. God's plan of redemption is here are broken people who can't save themselves. I will send someone to save them. Someone that they're not going to support, someone that they're not going to believe in, somebody that has complete faith in me will go out and fight the battle and conquer the Goliath for them because they couldn't do it themselves. But kind of blending the two, the practical application and the spiritual application, what was it about David that made the Israelites not believe in him? What's that? His youth and his stature. So what was it about the stature part of it? Like, how does the Bible describe David in 1 Samuel 17? It says he's handsome and ruddy. He was a pretty boy, right? That's what I hear when I see that he's handsome and ruddy. He's got ruddy cheeks, like not a lot of whiskers, but a lot more just like rosy cheeks. And they look at him and they're like, who is this kid? What is he doing? They looked at him and he didn't look like somebody who should be leading them out. Yeah, Rick?
We trust upon our visual interpretation of things. We trust upon our human wisdom. We have a hard time switching over to spiritual wisdom. And building on my first statement of trusting in God, there was a mutual trust there. And the fact that David trusted God to be by his side while he was doing God's bidding. And God also trusted David to do that bidding and do it unwaveringly. So it was a team effort. It was not something that just David did. It wasn't something that just God did. This was truly a team effort of God and David working together.
It's the idea that David had faith in God, but God, so that everybody else can hear, so that God also had faith in David. And it was manifested through, like, he knew David. He had referred to him as a man after my own heart. Why didn't David's brothers believe in him? Like,
Joseph's brothers believed in him.
yeah, like, they should have known, right? Go ahead, Pat.
I can tell you from personal experience, he was the youngest.
He was the youngest. There we go. We got some amens from that.
He was the youngest.
Yeah.
I mean, they knew him. They grew up with him, right?
Yeah.
And the rest of the family was not the one to step forward and seek, and take the lead.
Yeah. Yeah. Really? Like, I watched the thing he did yesterday. Like, you saw that, right? Yeah.
If I'm gripped by fear, then I'm going to be most likely envious and intimidated by someone else who's not. And they didn't care for David because he wasn't going to allow this giant to defy the holiness of the God of Israel.
So do we think that maybe jealousy played a part in it? Because deep down, like, they knew. So when David comes up and says, yeah, I can kill that giant, in the back of their mind, you know they were thinking about that lion and that bear. And I think part of, at least I would think, like, not only like, well, maybe David can do it, but what are the implications of that? If David can do it, then what does that mean about me? Like, I'm afraid now. Like, as long as we're all afraid, we're okay. But as soon as one person steps up and says, I'm not afraid anymore, I'll go fight. And I look and I think, I think Paul could actually do it. He fought a lion and a bear and he won. He could actually kill this giant. And now that makes me look really bad. Do we see that same thing occur in the life of Christ? You see the same thing happen. Like, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town. When Jesus came, everybody looked at him, and for a lot of reasons, like, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Said, is this Jesus, the carpenter's son? Like, they're confused about all of, like, the stature, right? They're confused about all of that. But then even the people that saw the miracles didn't believe in him. Even the people that should have known didn't believe. And I think that jealousy probably played a big part of that. And that he was the youngest. That he was the youngest. All right. So, in the story of... Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
One thing to add to that is probably the level of guilt in that David was really doing the job that they probably thought should fall to him. If we look at verse 26, he said, Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, What should be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, So should be done to the man who killed him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and his anger was aroused against David. He said, Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and insolence of your heart, for you have come to see the battle. And so they were saying that you're not even supposed to be here. Like,
Yeah.
this has been
Yeah.
for the whole.
Yeah, those few sheep. Like, he's battling lions and bears, and they call it those few sheep, right? All right, so in the story of David and Goliath, we see, like, practical application for our lives. And there's nothing wrong with rooting for the underdog. There's something in us that when we watch sport movies, we want to see it, that there's nothing wrong with it in sports. But when we see the story of David and Goliath, we don't see an underdog. We see somebody who had God's power, and that God looks upon people and differently than we look upon people. And just the other side of that coin of that story, we can see in it a theme. It's not an exact parallel, but a theme of redemption and what God and Christ accomplished on the cross. On Wednesday, we're fixing to wrap up. Bell's going to ring in a few minutes. On Wednesday, we're going to look at Moses and the Exodus. So, like I said, it covers a lot of ground in the Bible. Handouts are on the table out in the foyer. And we'll look at Moses and the Exodus on Wednesday. Thank you all.